We have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and we'll come to you.
In your opinion, is the current situation on academic campuses a continuation of the influence of the Frankfurt School or a perversion of it?
A continuation. I mean, the Frankfurt School, for people who don't know anything about Frankfurt School philosophy, is a group of philosophers in the 1920s in Germany who were expatriates. They moved to the United States and basically infiltrated American universities with an ideology that suggested, they realized, the Frankfurt School, they realized that Marxism, when Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital, what he was trying to do was describe how he thought society was going to work. It was actually descriptive, not necessarily proscriptive. It was, here's what's going to happen. He thought class warfare would eventually break out and destroy the capitalist infrastructure. When that didn't happen, World War I basically dissuaded the international left of this because there was no class uprising to start World War I. It turned out that poor French people were happy to fight poor German people, and all of them were happy to fight poor Russian people. So when that fell apart, what the Frankfurt School decided is, in order to make this change happen, we can't just wait for this change to happen, we have to change the culture. And the Frankfurt School basically decided to change the culture from the roots out. And in the 60s, what they discovered is that instead of using class, which is difficult, it's difficult to get a poor white guy to sympathize with a poor black guy, instead what they would use as a proxy is racial groups. They would use racial groups to tear down the United States and the capitalist system, suggesting that racial groups are the victims of capitalism. If we can just pose a racial group against a racial group, then that, and mix in a little bit of socialism in there, we'll end up with a more civilized world. Right? And the Soviet Union actually pushed this message in the 60s when it would put out propaganda about how the United States was racist. Right? Not how the United States was rich and poor. They didn't talk about income inequality. They talked about how the U.S. was racist and the Soviet Union was a wonderful place for people of all races, when in reality it was just a crap hole for people of all races. Yes, the Frankfurt School, which was led by people like Herbert Marcuse, it was very influential. I don't believe the full-scale conspiracy theory that everybody was taken over by them, but I think that influential thinkers do have influence beyond just the people who read their books. I mean, there's a wave that moves out. And in academia, there's no question that people who don't even know they've been influenced by Frankfurt School ideas have been influenced by Frankfurt School ideas. Just as if you ask most Democrats, you know, do you like Karl Marx, most of them will say no, even though they're buying directly into his philosophy.
I have a question about the alumni of the, say, Ivy or any goofy schools. Why don't the alumni pinch these schools off? Here is Brown University, for one example, is starting a fund drive for $2 billion. What kind of good are they going to do with that? It's because they've got a bunch of roughnecks and ingrates down there raising hell, and more $2 billion, so do some more of that. Thank you very much.
So the question is basically why alumni don't do anything. There are a couple of reasons why alumni don't do anything. The first is that alumni really don't pay that much attention to what's going on at their schools. They sort of see the name on the paper and they say, I went there, it was fun, I enjoyed it, I want to see it continue to succeed. They sign a check. That's really how most alumni deal with it. I know my wife used to do phone banking for UCLA. This is how you got people to give. Right? You call them up, you say, you remember how great your experience was at UCLA? We're still doing that for thousands of kids. Give us some money. That's how most alumni actually give. The second reason is that there is a bit of self-interest attached to alumni giving in certain industries. Meaning, I went to Harvard Law School. Harvard Law School is, depending on who you look at, either the first or second best law school in the nation. Right? It's Harvard and Yale, and they always battle it out. If I'm somebody who went to Harvard Law School, then I would prefer that for the next 30-odd years, when I plop down that credential, people say, ooh. Right? If Harvard were to drop in the college rankings, in the law school rankings, down to 20, it's not nearly as impressive that I went there. So there's a bit of self-interest attached to the continuing prominence of your school, and so people tend to give for that reason as well. In other words, the real question, and this is a question more broadly, is why people don't why people let other interests trump ideology, and that's one that, and philosophy of life, and that's, you know, that is the difficulty of American politics and politics in general, is getting people to understand that their own personal self-interest is not necessarily served by the short-term gains to be made if they're undermining the long-term foundations upon which success is based.
Well, it's clear you're definitely up on everything. I'd like to ask you a question, which I will do now. Will Hillary Clinton be indicted?
Will Hillary Clinton be indicted? Well, I'm not a clairvoyant, but I'm going to go no. And the reason I'm going to say no is because the justice system is entirely corrupt at the top levels on behalf of Democrats. And Dinesh D'Souza will spend time in prison, but Hillary Clinton will spend no time in prison. David Petraeus will end up having to make a settlement with the government. Hillary Clinton will not. My indicator, by the way, that she's not going to be indicted is that today Jay Carney came out and said Obama was rooting for Hillary, right? Which is the first real indicator that Obama is backing Hillary in the race. He's not going to endorse her full scale before South Carolina, but even that kind of small signal. The real question now is whether the FBI's investigation is so far that no one can stop them. And I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Listen, I hope she's indicted for purposes of justice and, yes, of politics, because I think that she is poised to be one of the most damaging. She's already one of the most damaging politicians in American history. She's the worst Secretary of State ever. But beyond that, she's poised to be the second worst president in American history if she doesn't get indicted. So I'm rooting the same as everybody else for her to get indicted. I don't trust the Loretta Lynch Justice Department to do actual justice. They're too busy cracking down on the Ferguson Police Department.
Hi. I've noticed that this new development with language like safe spaces, for instance, and trigger warnings has taken on a different kind of jargon than previous revolutionary movements. It's really therapeutic, and it's operating on an emotional level. And it seems to be resonating with kids even at the high school and elementary level. I try to talk to my nieces and nephews. It's really evident. There doesn't seem to be a foothold for a logical conversation to happen because emotions seem to completely fill the void. You seem to agree with that. So
totally.
What do you think is creating that environment? Because where I'm seeing it, it's a very difficult thing to even have a conversation.
Yeah. I mean, what's creating the environment of feelings is basically that we're the most prosperous nation in the history of humanity. So, I mean, if you've ever dealt with kids of very wealthy parents, very often they tend to be oversensitive and easily offended, and these are the kids of wealthy parents, namely the United States. And so what are they going to complain about? The fact that they're poor? They're not poor. The fact that they have a rough life? They don't. So what exactly is going to be their world-beating change? And there's nothing more empowering to these kids than saying the change that you seek is about you. Right? It's not even about the society at large. It's about you. Because your feelings are now our gauge of success or failure as a society. I mean, that's a pretty empowering message. I mean, it's almost a bizarre leftist incarnation of Walt Whitman's I Contain Multitudes. You know, what happens to me is what happens to all of society. My feelings matter than anything else more than anything else in the universe. Which is why, by the way, when you do argue with kids who are into this sort of stuff, it is imperative to actually use emotional argument. You know, logic does not work. And that doesn't mean that you have to make false arguments, but you can say you're being a fascist little, right? And that's okay, because the reality is they are being fascist little. And so that's okay. And the reason that is because what they're really doing, what the left now does, is they make emotionally based arguments about your character. You're a bad person, right? The safe space argument, the microaggression argument, isn't that you're even saying something untrue. It's that you are a bad human being. And the only way to defeat you're a bad human being in an argument is to say, no, actually, you're a bad human being for suggesting that I'm a bad human being without evidence. Only a jerk does that. Right? And then once we get beyond the character arguments, then we can argue about logic. But if it's going to be character arguments all the way to the well, then there's no way to beat a character argument with a logical argument. Mitt Romney discovered this in 2012. Right? You cannot make a logical argument and win people over while your opponent is saying that you kill people of cancer. Right? I mean, which was the actual argument against Mitt Romney. He fired people so that later their wives would die of cancer. This is the Obama campaign, and Mitt Romney's campaign was that guy's incompetent. Okay, that's not, so who are you going to vote for? The guy who kills people of cancer with his magic Wall Street powers? Or the guy who's mildly incompetent, right? So character arguments do matter. And this is why I encourage conservatives to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Logical arguments are not going to defeat the safe space microaggression mentality. The only thing that defeats that is showing these kids that what they are doing is actually immoral. It's not just ineffective, it's not just counterproductive, it's immoral. It is immoral to call the police if someone hurts your feelings. It makes you a bad human being if you call the police because somebody hurt your feelings. It makes you a fascist thug who wants to use a gun against someone. And when you speak to them like that, at least you can embarrass them enough for just a moment that maybe there's a gap.
I'm going to ask a question on behalf of my daughter and son-in-law. We were visiting them. He's in the military.
Well, thank you.
Over Christmas, and he asked the question, we have 4 kids homeschooled, should we be saving money to send them to college? You've described a situation. He seems to sense that this is maybe not a good place for his kids, but on the other hand, college served him well, his wife. So would you please respond?
So you have to gauge your own kids. I think it's a different, listen, I went to UCLA, I went to Harvard Law. There are no 2 more liberal institutions, leftists. I don't like the word liberal, they're not liberals, they're leftists. There are no 2 more leftist institutions on the planet than UCLA and Harvard Law School. I came out a stronger conservative because I used everything that I was learning as a starter. It wasn't the end point, right? It was, okay, you want me to read John Rawls? Okay, well now I'm going to go and I'm going to read Friedrich Hayek, right? I'm going to read various perspectives on the same issue so that I know how to counter the argument. So I can argue leftist positions better than most leftists can, right? So so if you have somebody who's a solid conservative, what I say to parents is about college, if your kid is not a solid conservative, if your kid doesn't have solid values by the time they're 18, they'll be a leftist by the time they're 21. That's the way that this works. All your heavy lifting is done before the college years. So you sort of have to, I mean, honestly, I think that if your kid isn't solidly